think there is. Obviously, just to explain what you're doing here, for the two questions that you're going to do your controlled assessment, question number one is going to ask you why this site is here and why was it developed, okay? So what we're looking for today from the site visit is any evidence of why this site is actually here. I will give you some ideas, some clues as to why it's here, and then when you go back to school and you're reading through stuff, you can actually add to that as well. Okay? So I'll give you plenty of clues about why the site was put here, why it was developed in the way that it was, which is what you need for question one. Okay, so for this first question, we're just looking at the local reasons why it was here. The second question, which you won't know about yet, is about why this might be a good site about social conditions in Sheffield in the 19th century. What evidence does it give you? And a lot of what you're going to see and do today is about gathering that evidence. But just to stress to you that for your controlled assessment, which is 25% of your GCSE, it is about interrogating this site, trying to dig it, not literally, because obviously it's full of dead bodies, but dig it for as much evidence as possible about what conditions were like in Sheffield in the 19th century, and also why this site is where it actually is. Okay? So this sheet basically goes through reason by reason. It's an opportunity for you to gather as much information as possible about why this site is where it is. So what I'll do is just now do sort of a general introduction for you. Okay? We're outside the front entrance, the main gates of the General Cemetery. When was the General Cemetery built? 1834. Okay, you might want to write that down. 1834. Okay? And this was the main gate, so this is the way in which you would have come through into the General Cemetery. Okay? Now, just to explain to you that the General Cemetery is a non-conformist cemetery. Have you done what a non-conformist is yet?
No.
Okay, now non-conformists were a big group in Sheffield in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. They were quite prosperous, many of them, but they were called non-conformists. Now the reason why they were non-conformists is that they didn't belong to the Church of England. So they were Protestant, like people in the Church of England, but they weren't members of the Church of England. They were members of groups like the Methodists, the Unitarians and various other different groups, and they were called non-conformists. The problem that the non-conformists had was that they couldn't be buried in burial grounds owned by the Church of England. They were banned from being buried in burial grounds of the Church of England. And so they had a real problem. Where were they going to be buried? If they couldn't be buried in burial grounds owned by the Church of England, what they had to do was build their own cemeteries. And so what you're going to see today is the cemetery that was actually built for the non-conformists who lived in Sheffield to be buried during this early part of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that helps to explain why this site is actually where it is, because of the problem that non-conformists had. It was for religious reasons. Okay, so it's all to do with religion. Now, the other thing to remember, another reason why the cemetery is where it is that this was open countryside. If we were stood here in 1830, just before the cemetery was actually built, all of this is just open countryside. It's fields, okay, with this river, the River Porter, running through it. So we're in the bottom of a valley. So you've got to imagine you're in the bottom of the valley. It's going to look a bit like the Peak District. It's going to be all these rolling hills, and it's right on the edge of Sheffield. And so it was really cheap land. So that's an economic reason for why the cemetery was where it is, because it was really, really cheap land here. Because it was just farmland, so it's cheap to buy. So it's a good place. If you're going to build a cemetery, it's a good place to actually put it. The other reason to put it here, and again this is more of a social reason, is that some of the wealthy people in Sheffield didn't want to live in the centre of Sheffield anymore. The way it used to work in cities like Sheffield when they sprung up in that early part of the Industrial Revolution is that the wealthy, the factory owners, the business owners, would live next door to their workers. But by the time you get to the 1830s, more and more middle-class factory owners, people like Mark Firth, who you're going to see in a minute, that they wanted to move out. They wanted to move out of the smelly city centres and move out into these countryside areas. And so more and more rich, wealthy, middle-class business, steel mill owners are moving out into this area of Sheffield. So again, what do they want? Well, a cemetery would be really important to them. Managed to get the wasp. So a cemetery would be really, really important to them. Okay? Because the other thing to remember is in that sort of early Victorian period, 1834, this early part of the Industrial Revolution, that the Victorians made a big show of death. It was very important to them. Socially, it was really important. These days, we don't do the same thing, do we? We sort of hide it away and we don't make a big thing about it. But the Victorians made a big thing about death. They used to celebrate death. Because they had strong Christian beliefs, whether they were a nonconformist or a member of the Church of England, death was really important to them. And so they made a real show of death. And it was also a way of actually showing how wealthy you were. So people would show off in death. The bigger the monument you had, the richer you were, the bigger status you had. So again, that was a social reason to have a cemetery like this. It was a way of actually the wealthy and the rich showing off that wealth and making a show of that wealth even in death. And you're going to see a lot of that today, and I'll point some of those memorials out to you. Okay, so that was another, if you like, social reason, and it's also sort of an economic reason as well, that the wealthy wanted to make a show of death. So they wanted a nice big flash cemetery to be buried in. These rich people, these nonconformists, okay, this is where they wanted to be buried. So another reason why the cemetery was built here, and it's an economic reason, is that it was a business. It was a way of making money. So this was run as a business. So the bigger the monument, the more you had to pay. The bigger the plot of land you had, the more you had to pay. So it was a way of actually making money, this cemetery. So there were really good economic reasons for doing it because it was good business. The other thing, of course, that you've got is you've got a lot of people dying in the 1830s in Sheffield. We've got cholera epidemics. Anybody know what cholera is? So that would be social, wouldn't it? Cholera. Anybody know what cholera is? How it spreads? Katie?
Is it poo?
Sorry?
Poo.
Poo. It is caused by poo, but it's poo in what?
In water.
It's in water. Okay, so it's polluted water, normally polluted by poo. Well done, Katie. Okay? And so cholera killed loads of people in Sheffield in the 1830s. There's a big epidemic in 1834. There was one in 1832 that killed less people. And so cholera was a big killer. So lots and lots of people were dying. So there's real pressure to bury these people. And of course, lots of them are nonconformists who can't be buried in the Church of England. And so the cemetery would also not just open its doors to the wealthy, also poor nonconformists were buried here as well. But they would have to pay money. They wouldn't pay much, but they would have to pay money in order to be buried here. So in this cemetery you do have a real mix of the rich from Sheffield in that period, but also you've got some of the poor, but they're less evident. You can't find much evidence of the poor being buried in that cemetery, but I will point some of it out to you as we go round where some of the poor are actually buried. Okay? Any questions so far? So they are Protestant, like the Church of England. It's just they had a big falling out with the Church of England. So when you look at the national reasons with Mr. Oakley, when he's teaching this to you, he'll go through exactly what nonconformists were. You don't need to know much about it now, other than the fact that they can't be buried in the Church of England. They had a big falling out with the Church of England, and they're not allowed to be buried in Church of England graveyards. And most of the graveyards were owned and controlled by the Church of England. Okay? Now, if you look at the gatehouse, what do you notice about it? Anything you notice about it? Lydia, come on, what do you notice about it? Big, grand, flashy, showy. Why do you think they made it so grand like that? What do you think the business owners of this cemetery were trying to do? Yeah. Okay. The flasher it is, the more that the wealthy are going to want to be buried there. Okay. So the design was quite important. You're trying to show off because you're trying to attract those wealthy mill owners, those wealthy businessmen to be buried here, to have their families buried here. Okay. So you're making a big show of it. Why do you think it's so tall? You know, the wall that goes round the cemetery is really high. Why do you think the wall was so high? Why go to so much trouble to wall the whole of the cemetery off and build such a tall wall? It wasn't, well done, it wasn't the monuments that they were worried about being stolen. There was something else they were worried about being stolen in the 1830s when they built this place.
Was it the body?
It's the body. Body snatching. Okay? In the 1830s, there's a new medical school that opens up in Sheffield that eventually becomes Sheffield University. Okay? So there's a new medical school training doctors. In order to train doctors, they need to be able to cut up bodies to study anatomy. This is in the 1830s that they're doing it. But the only bodies that you can get your hands on in these medical schools are the bodies of criminals who have been hanged. And so there's a bit of a shortage of bodies. There isn't enough bodies to go around. And so what some people did, and they were called resurrection men, was that they would break into cemeteries, they'd usually have a lookout to actually keep watch to see which bodies were just being buried, because the fresher the body the better, and the more money they would get for it. And they would go into those cemeteries in the dead of night, and they would snatch those bodies, they would dig those bodies back up, and then sell them to the medical school. And so the Victorians had this huge fear of body snatching. It was a real problem, because there was a lot of money involved. For a good, fresh body in the 1830s, these resurrection men could basically get as much as they would normally earn in a year being a labourer, digging ditches or building walls. So there was a lot of money to be made out of digging up these bodies. And so what the business people here did, said, well, look, our cemetery is the most secure in Sheffield. There's a gatehouse that's got a warden who lives on site, and it's got a really tall wall, so body snatching is not going to be a problem. And there is absolutely no evidence that body snatching ever took place here. It did in other cemeteries in Sheffield, but not here. So again, it's if you like, it's a business reason, it's an economic reason for building the cemetery in this way and developing the cemetery in this way to attract people in. It's to say, well, look, it's really secure. Because the Victorians had this real fear of body snatching. And it was a real problem in this period. So that's why you have this big wall, and you'll see it later going around the whole of the cemetery. Okay? Any other questions so far?
What was the
Okay, geographical reasons, cheap land. And it's in the countryside, Katie. This is in the countryside. I know you can. In 1830 it was in the countryside, so it was a really attractive site. It was a beautiful site. All across this valley and up the other side of the valley. You have this beautiful outlook, and then they put in the botanical gardens to make it look even more flash. So you have to imagine none of these houses here, this is all countryside here, and then you have this wonderful cemetery. So again, a geographical reason would be, well, that's going to draw more people in. Not only is it cheap land, but it's attractive land. And it's near a lovely river. It doesn't look too lovely these days, but it was near a lovely river as well. You want to do question 2 in a minute? We're going to do that in a minute, so we will do question 2. So we've got a lot for question 1. So we've got economic reasons, we've got some social reasons, we've got some religious reasons, we've got some geographical reasons. We might have got a few others, because I mentioned about the body snatching, for example, might be one that you want to put in as others. Okay? So we've already got quite a few clues. So when you actually come to study this with Mr. Oakley, when you're doing lessons, you'll find more evidence as well. But again, in question 1, but more so in question 2, it's showing evidence that you've used the site. Okay.
Was it the 1830s?
This is the 1830s.
Oh,
So this is built in 1834. Okay? Right. onwards to the catacombs. Question 2.
Yes.
Okay. So for question 2, okay, the site of the General Cemetery will give visitors a profound insight into social conditions in Sheffield during the Industrial Revolution. How valid is this interpretation? So that's going to be your question 2. Does this give you a really good insight into what social conditions were like in Sheffield in the 19th century? Okay. So we're going to start. So most of the rest of what I'm going to do, I'll do a few more why the cemetery is where it is. But most of what we're going to do is concentrate on page 2. And if you look over the back there, okay, you've got list any evidence of social conditions in the 19th century from the site itself, and what evidence does the site give you about social conditions in the 19th century. So as we're going round, just be aware that you're trying to fill in both and just give yourself as much information as possible. But the easy way to think about this is that basically from now on, most of what we're going to do is address that question: what evidence does the cemetery give us as a site about what social conditions were like in Sheffield in the 19th century? Okay? So those are things we're going to concentrate. Now behind you, we can't see it, is an area called the catacombs. Okay? They're a bit grisly, the catacombs, and I'll come to the reasons why later. But these were put in when the cemetery was built in the 1830s, okay, through into the 1840s. Now what the catacombs are is that they're a series of rooms that go back into the hillsides. And the idea was, and it was based on an idea from Paris, the idea was that you would buy one of those rooms and you could put your family members in those rooms. So it would become like a family burial plot for the rest of time where you could put these bodies. So if you were to go into one of those rooms now, and once a year they open some of these up, they do a special tour where they open up some of these catacombs so you can go in. Most of them are empty, to reassure you. But if you go in them, you'll see these shelves. Okay, and onto those shelves they would put the coffins. Okay, so they were the family catacombs. Originally they would have had big metal doors in front of them, but obviously it's all been bricked up now. But they would have had metal doors on them. So these were things called the catacombs. They were very, very expensive. Okay, they were designed for the wealthy of the wealthy, if you like. They were really expensive because often these rooms, there were 2 or 3 rooms built into the back of the hillside, and they were very, very expensive. But C-A-T-A, catacombs, with 1 O, okay? But they weren't very popular with the wealthy. They really didn't want them, they didn't have any interest, and so the cemetery was left with many of them just left empty, nothing to do with them. Why do you think they weren't popular with the wealthy?
Is it because like other people coming by, or like people burying might be able to see how like rich they are?
Good. They weren't flash enough. Well done, you. Yeah, they weren't flash enough. Okay? And if we're looking for evidence of the difference between rich and poor, well, there is a piece of evidence about the mentality of the rich, isn't there? That they want to make a real show of their wealth, even in death. It says something about their family. And those catacombs just weren't showy enough.
Could the poor people not afford them?
And of course, for poor people, they just couldn't afford them anyway. And so most of them were just left empty. But there was a flood in Sheffield. Some of you might have read about this in the past or know about this. There was a flood in Sheffield in 1863, I think it was, and a dam burst further up the River Don, and hundreds upon hundreds of people were killed by the floodwaters because this dam burst in the centre of Sheffield. So the water just travelled down from further up, and it just went through all these heavily built up areas where loads and loads of people lived, and they were drowned. Lots of the victims of that flood are buried in those catacombs because that was the only spare space they had for such a large number of people all killed at the same time.
Were they non-conformists, sir?
And by that stage, as I'll come on to do later, the business here, by 1863, they'd actually sold off half the cemetery to the Church of England. So they were a mixture of non-conformists and Anglicans. Okay, so they'd actually sold off half the cemetery. because it was such a big area, they thought, wow, we can make more money by just selling off half of it to the Church of England. One of the other stories I was told by one of the guides here, and I don't know whether this is true, and you get different stories from different guides who work here and do the sort of professional guided tour, although I'm just as good as they are. But one of the stories is that they have loads of babies buried in those catacombs. Babies who died in infancy in the hospitals and in the workhouses, and I'll say more about the workhouses later, are buried in there. I don't know whether that's true or not. But for your study, the importance of those catacombs, why they're good evidence about what Sheffield was like socially in the 19th century, is that they just weren't popular.
Where are the poor people going?
We'll do that later. Libby.
Where did they sell half of it off?
In the 1860s. Can't remember the precise date. It's around about 1863. You'll be able to check it. But it's in the 1860s that they begin selling bits off. And I'll show you the bits that they sold off. 1863, I think.
I think it was 1864. I looked and it
Good
was,
moment.
it was the 11th and 12th of March,
1864. Do you want to take over now?
Well, I've put 1863.
Right, it's 1864. I don't trust me, I trust you.
Thank you.
1864, Sheffield flood. What was the total number of victims?
I got 81, but I don't think it is.
No,
I
it's
think it's
more
much
than that.
more.
Yeah, it's definitely more than that. There's a plaque. We can't see it now because obviously it's all walled off, but there's a plaque. Sorry? 1864, Olivia.
No, I thought this is where.
Yeah, definitely.
When did the people get? When did it get sold?
In the 1860s, they began actually selling off bits and pieces of the cemetery. That was all during the 1860s. They began selling it off. It wasn't one particular date. Okay. Right. Just to point something out. This used to be unlocked. Obviously, they lock it up now. This was the general cemetery toilet. This was the original toilet put in the 1830s, 1834, when the cemetery was actually built. So this is the original toilet. Okay. If we could go in, you'd see how it works. Okay, the toilet works by having a chute down into the river. So if you're looking at social conditions in Sheffield, and we were talking about, Katie said about poo in the water. Okay, well there's your poo and wee in the water that causes the cholera. So remember, this is quite a flash cemetery. This would have looked really, really impressive in the 1830s. But the toilet that you would use in the cemetery just emptied into the river. You know, people would come, I mean, in the Victorian age, people would come in for a picnic. It was like a family outing. And you'd spend all day or all morning here, so you needed the toilet. But it does give you evidence. And it's a shame we can't open it and show you a picture of it because it's just a bench and a hole down into the river. But it does give you evidence about social conditions, doesn't it? That this was supposed to be a cemetery for the wealthy. Okay, and yet their toilet facilities were straight into the river. That river flows on straight down into the centre of Sheffield, where the poor people of Sheffield are getting their drinking water. Okay, where they're doing their washing. Nice. Okay, because you're quite a way out of Sheffield here. I know you can't imagine it now, but you're quite a way out from the centre of Sheffield. And so it just flow down in the river. Okay, so that is the toilet, the privy. Mark Firth, if you like, was probably the richest man in Sheffield in the whole of the 19th century. He was incredibly wealthy. He was a real, what we call a philanthropist. That's a really good word. You can check that one later. I can't spell it. Which means that he gave a lot of money to charity, did lots of charitable works. He actually set up Sheffield University. Okay. There's also Firth Park over the other side of Sheffield, which he gave money to build a public park for people to use, working class people. He was a nonconformist. Okay, which is obviously why he's buried here. Very, very wealthy. How do you think he made his money? Yeah, what particular type of factory? Yeah, he's a steel factory owner. He's the biggest in Sheffield. Okay, fabulously wealthy, really, really rich, and this is where Mark is buried, along with his family. If we were to lift those stones in front of you, there's a room. You'd walk down a flight of steps into a room underneath, and all his family are still there. They're still there in their coffins. They're still buried there, and this is where he's buried. So I don't want you to get too squeamish about it. Charlotte's looking absolutely shocked and appalled now. Where have you bought us, Mr. Fuller? This is just terrible. But no, they do open it occasionally, okay? But this is one of Sheffield's wealthiest men. So what we're looking for is evidence of the wealthy, okay? Because we were talking about the rich wanting to make a huge show of their wealth, and of course with Mark Firth being so wealthy, he's got one of the most impressive tombs in the whole of the cemetery, okay? So it does give you a lot of evidence about the wealthy, but we can get other evidence from this area as well. We've got another tomb memorial over there for somebody very wealthy. This is one of the top spots to be buried in the cemetery, okay? One of the very, very top spots. Mark Firth bought this plot in the 1830s. When did Mark Firth die?
1880.
Okay, so he bought this in the 1830s as soon as the cemetery was built. He buys a family plot so that anybody in his family can be buried here. Okay, he's not buried in it until 50 years later, but he still buys it. And again, that shows you something about the mentality of the wealthy. That, you know, even when they were in their when he was in his 30s and 40s, he was preparing for his own death and members of his family dying as well. And again, that's because so many people did die. So, what I want you to do now, I'm just going to give you sort of 5 minutes. There's lots of information on this memorial that will give you some clues about the wealthy in Sheffield. You know, look at his wives, look at his children, and when his children died, maybe when his wives died, there's a clue there. Look for a word called relict as well, okay? And you've also got that memorial over there. Have a look at them, write down the information that's either on the Mark Firth one or the one across there. Write down the information and try and think about clues about what this tells you about the rich in Sheffield in the 19th century. And it does. The information on there and the information on that one does tell you a great deal about the wealthy. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to do that, and then we're going to meet just up there, just across there, so not standing in here. We'll meet just there, and I want you to come up with what these two memorials tell you about Sheffield in the 19th century, okay? So you've got 3 or 4 minutes to come up with that. So you need to record the information that's so you've looked at, well, 2 of the most prominent memorials in the whole of the cemetery. These are 2 of the wealthiest families. This is the place to be buried in the cemetery, okay? Because everybody's got to come past here, it's a crossroads, so everybody's going to see these 2 memorials. So if we're looking for evidence of what it tells us about social conditions in Sheffield, obviously this is all about the wealthy, isn't it? Because these are big flash memorials, as we said before. So what evidence does it give us about the wealthy? What do we find? What do we notice when we looked at the information on those particular tombs?
That even rich people, their children died young.
Right, so even for the wealthy, very high infant mortality. Okay? That even someone as rich as Mark Firth is losing children at a very young age. Okay? So that shows you really good evidence about social conditions in the 19th century in Sheffield. That, you know, disease, high infant mortality, all of those sorts of things wasn't something that just affected the poor, it also affected the rich as well. Okay? Any other evidence that we've got from looking at those tombs? Tara?
Mark had 2 wives.
Right, 2 wives. So what might the significance of that be, the fact that he had 2 wives? I mean, obviously not at the same time, because bigamy, being married twice, is not allowed, okay? But what's the significance of having 2 wives? What happened to the first wife?
She died.
Right, she died. Okay? How might she have died? Yeah, during childbirth, and she did die during childbirth as well. So what you might find, and we're going to do a little exercise in a minute, is that you might find, if you're working out the average life expectancy of men and women, that women should be lower, I mean quite significantly lower, because they would die in childbirth. Anything else we got from those tombs? So he's married twice. Did you see that word relict?
Yeah.
Okay, and it was used to describe one of his wives, wasn't it? The relict of Mark Firth. What do you think that means? Good. He owns it. Okay? That legally, when you married in the 19th century, you became the property of your husband. Okay? And hence the word relict means that your husband owned you. And when he died, you were the leftover. You were the relict. So what does that show about attitude towards women?
Women were in the social class lower than men.
Right, yeah. So women were regarded as being inferior to men. And legally, women didn't have the same status as men, because once you got married, you were the property of your husband, and your husband could do with you what he saw fit. So if he wanted to lock you up in a lunatic asylum, he could. If he wanted to take all your property that you may have owned when you married, he could, because you were his property. Okay? So you can get a lot of evidence from this. Now, we've timed this absolutely perfectly, so we're just going to move around to the Methodist chapel over there, and then I'm going to get you to do a little activity, see if we can work something important out, okay? This, if you like, is the centre of the cemetery, the non-conforming cemetery where it's built in 1834. Obviously it's all bricked up now, we want to open it as an art centre. Get the men to do the bells, but it's quite a big space in behind. I mean, I suppose first of all, if we're dealing with this thing about non-conformism, what would you describe the architecture of this building? It's a really strange looking building, isn't it? Where do you think it gets its influences from when they built it? It doesn't look like a church, does it?
It looks a bit like the thing in Athens.
Yeah, right, so like the Parthenon, yeah. What else does it look like? What other part of the world might you see, especially Norway, like that? So we've got Greece, we've got Egypt, yeah, ancient Egypt. So they're sort of using some Greek ideas, some Egyptian ideas, some Roman ideas for their architecture, and making a chapel that doesn't look anything like a church. Why do you think they did that? Why do you think they went for a design that deliberately didn't look anything like a Church of England church?
Because these non-conformists were kind of didn't agree with the Church of England, so they kind of chose to
Brilliant. Yeah, they're just showing how different they are. Well, we're not part of the Church of England, so we're not going to conform to how you build a Church of England. We're going to go for something that really is going to stand out and is evidence of the difference between us and the Church of England, which is why they went for a building like this. Okay, so you're at the centre of the cemetery. This is where the wealthiest are buried. Okay, the nearer you are to the crossroads where we've just been with Mark III, and this chapel, the richer you are going to be. So this is Sheffield super rich. 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860. So they 4 decades, this is where the super rich of Sheffield are going to be buried. Okay, so I'm going to get you to do, sorry.
Someone over there lived to 95 years old. Is that like?
So what we're going to do now, because we're looking at life expectancy, we're going to do a little, Libby, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So, we're going to do a little activity now, just try and work out life expectancy. Okay, and it's life expectancy for the rich that we're dealing with here. Okay, so easiest way to do this is to sample 10, 20 different tombs, or 10 or 20 different individuals. Okay, try and get a mix of people. Try and get 20. 20 makes it really meaningful. Get 20 individuals, just pick them at random. Scribble down their ages on the tomb, so that it could be 1 year, 92 years, 5 years. And I want you to work out the average life expectancy for the people that you sample. And try and get a sample size of around about 20, okay? And work in sort of 3s or 4s to do this, because that will speed it up. And just to complicate it, I want you to do 1 list of women and 1 list of men. Okay, because so 10 each, 12 each, I don't know, something like that. Just to try and see if there is this difference between life expectancy for men and women. I did this last year and it worked. Okay? And you get a sense of what life expectancy is. So if you've got calculators on your phones or wherever, you can work out your life expectancy. So you need to sample around about 20 different names, 25 different names. Try and get an equal number between men and women and work out that average life expectancy for men and women. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to complete this task. But, okay, you need to take care just use the tombs along this stretch, up and down down that flight of stairs there. And you've got 10 minutes
Go, guys.
to come up with the goods. Okay, look out then. Get the calculators out. Working out. Lily's still working out.
We got 35.
Right, so one group's got 35 for both, so that's quite low as a life expectancy. So we've got 35 as an average life expectancy, and that's for both men and women. So we've got 35. Your group's going to be around about 60 for both men and women, isn't it?
Because of
Yours?
battery language.
Yeah, okay. So yours is going to be around about 60. So we've got 35, we've got 60. Any others?
We got 53 for women. Is that around?
Right, so 53 for women, 47 for men, so roughly sort of similar, but again, lower than you would expect today. What's the average life expectancy today?
72.
73 and 71.
No, 72.
I thought it was in the 80s now.
It's 82.
Yeah, I think it's in the 80s now, average life expectancy. So it's much, much higher than that. Right, let's keep going then. What about this group at the back?
We got women 51 and men 41.
Okay, so we've got women 51, men 41. So again, lower life expectancy. Although we're not getting the lower for women, are we? Olivia, done yours? Oh, come on.
I think they put exorcisms in there.
You got men as 49.
Right, men is 49.
Women 36 and men 55.
So women 36, men 33. We're just waiting for Olivia now, are we? And so I don't know who you are.
Yeah.
Olivia's got 424.
It's a bit higher than I think Lucy Bauer is the true deputy.
Yeah, I'm going to suck that blackness out of
You
it.
don't suck it, Lucy.
Yeah, but with
You
the
just
cross.
pass it out.
Can I just say, ladies, this whole conversation's on film.
Well, Lucy Barrow agrees.
Lucy's an exorcist, and we're going to perform it on Lucy Bauer.
She's like a demented.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Suck the
7.
life out of her.
Divided by 7. 69.
69 men.
49.
Right, 69 men, 49 women. Good, we like that. Got one more left to come in, I think. One more left to come in.
This does make great video footage. Students doing maths.
Or struggling.
I think it should just be up to every video.
Just us talking.
Model students over here. 60, round number. Is Celine's going to watch this?
What you need to do,
She's been
Lucy,
forced to watch it.
Hi, Selena.
Right,
If she's ever well enough.
and then you have to cast the demon. We're doing it.
59 men,
We've decided to do an
women.
You know, I can help you.
Okay, so I would say, and you might want to scribble this down then, and you could use this in question 2, that from the sample, and it's not a scientific sample, okay, but from the sample that we've done, I would have said life expectancy for men and women, and we'll just do it for men and women, seems to be around about somewhere between 45 and 50 if you were to average out what we've just come out with there.
Where do we write this?
Okay.
Which section?
So if we're looking at evidence of social conditions and life expectancy, which will be on that back of the sheet, then obviously I would say that life expectancy is somewhere between 45 and 50 would be a really, really good average from the samples that we've done. So what that shows us then is that if this is the very, very wealthy of Sheffield, their life expectancy isn't brilliant. It's probably going to be a lot higher than working class people. I'll show you where they're buried in a minute. But it's still lower, isn't it? Why is it that low? Given that they're quite wealthy and there are quite a few people here who lived into their 80s. Why do you think the life expectancy is so low, even for the very rich? Katie?
Is it because more people died as children, so then that brings it
And
down?
that's the thing to remember. More died as children. Even for the wealthy, they're still losing lots of people, lots of their children, before their 6th or 7th birthday. And that's what's pushing that average down. Okay? If you make it beyond your 6th or 7th birthday, then obviously you've got a pretty good chance of living a long life. So average life expectancy around about somewhere between 45 and 50, I reckon, is about spot on. So you can use that in question 2. Okay? Looks as if it's eased off, which is good. So we're now going to walk up to, I'm going to show you where the poor are buried, just very, very briefly. Okay? And we're going to walk up to the Anglican church, and then we're going to look at 2 graves in particular which is the grave of the Clarborough and a chap called Samuel Holbrook. So that's where we're going. One of the things that you're going to have to look for question 2 is that you're going to be required to say, well, does the site give me any evidence about the poor? We've got quite a bit of evidence about the rich and the wealthy. They're very, very visible because of the monuments that they built. Where's the evidence of the poor? And there isn't any. I mean, I can tell you where they're buried, okay? If you were to go through there, walk up the back there, there is a pit there that's got 64 paupers buried in it. So it's a big burial pit, and these are paupers who are buried there. They've come from the workhouse. Have you done workhouses yet? Yeah? Okay, so obviously no social security or things like that. You had to go into the workhouse either because you were too old and you couldn't work anymore, or you had no money, or you're unemployed and you went into the workhouse. When they died, the workhouse would pay usually a shilling or 2 shillings to have the paupers buried here. And they were just put into mass pits in the graveyard. One of those is behind me. It's the biggest one. It's got, I think, 65 paupers buried in the same pit. What they would do is just open the pit up again and then put another body on top, dig a bit further down, put another body on top, and so it's just a big burial pit. But there's no evidence I can tell you about it, but you couldn't get that from the site. I just happen to know it's there because I've seen the burial maps and I know where it is. So that's one of the great limitations for this site, is that you can't really get a sense of the poor, or the people, if you like, who are at the bottom of the social level. You get a lot of evidence about the people at the middle and the top, but not at the bottom. And that's a real problem with this as a site. Okay? So I just thought I'd tell you that that is where they're buried. Okay? Right, onwards to the Anglican Church. One of the things that you're going to have to look for question 2 is that you're going to be required to say, well, does the site give me any evidence about the poor? We've got quite a bit of evidence about the rich and the wealthy. They're very, very visible because of the monuments that they built. Where's the evidence of the poor? And there isn't any. I mean, I can tell you where they're buried, okay? If you were to go through there, walk up the back there, there is a pit there that's got 64 paupers buried in it. So it's a big burial pit, and these are paupers who are buried there. They've come from the workhouse. Have you done workhouses yet? Yeah? Okay, so obviously no social security or things like that. You had to go into the workhouse either because you were too old and you couldn't work anymore, or you had no money, or you're unemployed and you went into the workhouse. When they died, the workhouse would pay usually a shilling or 2 shillings to have the paupers buried here. And they were just put into mass pits in the graveyard. One of those is behind me. It's the biggest one. It's got, I think, 65 paupers buried in the same pit. What they would do is just open the pit up again and then put another body on top, dig a bit further down, put another body on top, and so it's just a big burial pit. But there's no evidence I can tell you about it, but you couldn't get that from the site. I just happen to know it's there because I've seen the burial maps and I know where it is. So that's one of the great limitations for this site, is that you can't really get a sense of the poor, or the people, if you like, who are at the bottom of the social level. You get a lot of evidence about the people at the middle and the top, but not at the bottom. And that's a real problem with this as a site. Okay? So I just thought I'd tell you that that is where they're buried. Okay? Right, onwards to the Anglican Church. In the 60s, half of the cemetery was sold off to the Church of England. But the nonconformists, they didn't need the space anymore, and so they sold it to the Church of England. Because remember, this is a business. Okay, so it was a way of making money. And so, you're right, Olivia.
Spider.
Oh, it's a spider. Never mind, Olivia. So on your right-hand side is an Anglican church. Notice how different that Anglican church is from the Nonconformist chapel. It looks like your bog standard English country church. And again, this reinforces this point that one of the things that this site does tell, it might not tell you very much about the poor, but one of the things it does tell you about is that obviously in the 19th century there were religious divisions in society. and that the two religions like to make a real show of how different they were from each other. So it does give you that real sense that religion was something that did divide Victorian society between Church of England and, in this case, non-conformists. And so that does look very, very different. So the next thing we're going to do now, okay, is look at the two graves, two specific graves. The Clarborough and a chap called Samuel Holbury. And that will sort of be our last stop, given that the weather's not brilliant at the moment. You're going to have to squeeze into that area because it's quite a small area, and I want to sort of get you around both graves. So you're going to have to squeeze in. Watch out for the brambles and the stinging nettles. It wasn't too bad when we were here a couple of weeks ago, but just take... This is the grave of the Clarborough family, okay? Robert Clarborough was a butcher, so he's middle class. He's not extremely wealthy, so he can't afford one of those big monuments, but he's a pretty successful butcher. And this is his family plot. So all of these people are buried where you stood. If I could get Katie or Charlotte just to read what's on there, because I know you can't all see it, okay? So if you just listen to what they've got to read, you'll see why this is really good evidence of social conditions in Sheffield in the 19th century.
The beloved children of Robert and Martha Clarborough, who died 25, Henry, April 15, 1837, school, aged 5 years. Martha, August, when is that all the days? Yeah. August 15, 1848, aged 3 weeks. Robert, July 9, 1851, aged 8 years. Emily, August 22nd, 1851, aged 6 months. John, September 9th, 1851, aged 11 years. Margaret Day, Davy, April 1st, 1855, aged 1 year and 1 month. Also the above named Robert Clarborough, who died May 15th, 1867, aged 55 years. Also Martha Clarborough, his wife, who died May 20th, aged 66.
Okay, so that's really good evidence of what?
They all died about
Yeah, good infant mortality. These are quite wealthy people. He's a butcher, he's middle class, he's quite a successful butcher, and yet look at all the children that die. Okay, fantastic. If you've got a camera, it's a fantastic picture to get. You could use it in question 2 of your controlled assessment. It's a really good piece of evidence of what social conditions were like in Sheffield. Because like I say, this guy is a butcher, okay? Prosperous, relatively wealthy, yet look at that high infant mortality, even for a wealthy family like this. Okay, so it's really good evidence, that particular grave. I mean, it's unfortunate because of the weather, we're going to have to sort of cut this short, otherwise you're going to get absolutely drenched. But obviously we'd spend a bit more time. There are quite a few graves like this where you can sort of record that information. But if you go on the General Cemetery website, they've got a few more where you can actually look at these different graves and you can use those for questions too. I'm going to show you one more grave just around the corner here. You're going to need to squeeze up again. I'll get somebody to read it out in a minute if you can't see it, and you get a chance to see it in a minute when you come round. One of the things for question 2 that you're looking for is evidence of the poor in this cemetery, and one of the few pieces of evidence that you've got of the poor is this chap called Samuel Holbury, okay, who's got this nice, expensive, very ornate tombstone here, very expensive, not the sort of thing that a normal working class person could afford. But Samuel Holbery is working class. He's somebody who's a carpenter, and he is working class. And yet, here he is amongst all these nice middle class people, and it's interesting why. So I need somebody to read out what it says on that tomb. Somebody who's really good at these sort of things with really good eyesight. You're nearest. So read it out for everybody.
I don't know what
Sacred.
sacred to the memory of Samuel Holbery, who at the early age of 27 died in York Castle after suffering an imprisonment of 2 years and 3 months, June 21st, 1842, for advocating what to him appeared to be the true interest of the people of England. Vanished is the dream of life. The rich and poor find no distinction here. The great and lowly end their care and strive. The well-beloved may have affections there. But at the last, the oppressor and the slave shall equal stand before the bar of God, of him who life and hope and freedom gave to all that through this veil of tears of God. Let none then murmur against the wise decree that opened the door and set the captive free, also of Samuel John, his son, who died in his infancy.
Thank you very much.
So I didn't get that. Can you read it again, please?
So, what's it sort of saying on that tombstone? What do you think he did? This working class man. What do you think he did? What do you think he stood for?
Did he sort of communism maybe a little bit, but he sort of stood up against his higher rich people.
Brilliant.
To say that it's not really fair.
That's exactly it. Brilliant. He was what we call a Chartist. And you'll look at Chartism. It's one of the things that you'll look at. He was a Chartist. He campaigned to get working class men the vote. Maybe it's not women, because maybe he was crazy enough to suggest women should get the vote at that time. But in 1842, he was a Chartist who believed, and he's called Samuel Holbery, who believed that working men should have the vote, because only that way could conditions for working men and working women actually improve. Okay, and he was what we call a physical force Chartist. He was put in prison because he tried to blow up the magistrates' court in Sheffield with dynamite. So he's like a little bit of a terrorist almost. Okay, but he was somebody who believed, obviously, very, very strongly in working men having the vote. Even before I came to Sheffield, when I did university, I studied Chartism. I knew all about this guy. So he's quite a well-known Chartist figure. He's a real hero. 10,000 people turned out for his funeral in 1842 in Sheffield. There's a plaque to him outside the City Hall in the Peace Gardens. So he's quite a well-known figure. So what does it show us about Sheffield in the 19th century? If we're using this site as evidence about social conditions and society in Sheffield in the 19th century, what does this show us?
That working class had the vote and they began to start rising up against it.
Excellent. So if we're looking at evidence of society in 19th century Sheffield, it wasn't a happy society. We've got a big gap between rich and poor. We've looked at those poor old paupers who are just buried in one big pit. And we also get a sense that for working people, they were fighting against the system. They wanted better rights. They wanted the vote. You know, it wasn't a happy, fluffy place, 19th century Sheffield. It was a place at a time where there was real tension, there was real social strife, and people were really, really suffering. And so this is absolutely fantastic evidence. And it's also, bizarrely, one of the few examples where I can say, well, there you go, he was working class. And he's probably the only one where I've actually got specific evidence above ground. And that's one of the great limitations of this as a site. It doesn't tell us enough about working people. And this is one of the few pieces of evidence that it does. So when you're doing question 2 of your controlled assessment, make sure you mention Samuel Holbery. Get yourself a picture of his grave, get a picture of that quote, because it does give you really, really good evidence that society in Sheffield was not a happy society. It was a society in which there was real tension and real struggle. We know that there was high infant mortality, we know about disease, we know about this gap between rich and poor, we know about this strife over religion, and here is strife over politics. So we get a real sense from this site that 19th century Sheffield really wasn't a happy place to be. Okay?
What year was it? Not
This is 1842. He was buried in 1842.
so
Katie.
1840 was the place.
Yeah. Okay? So if you can get yourself a photo, I can see some people's worksheets are turning into mush. Okay, so get yourself a photo. There used to be one on the website. I don't know if it's still there. They've had real problems with their website, I found 2 weeks ago. But get yourself a photo. If you haven't seen it, get around, get yourself a photo. Once you've got your photo, I'll meet you back up on the path over there and then we'll walk down. Okay?
Not one.